Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to London.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Free Market Roadshow London. My name is Razi Ginzberg. I'm the founder and director of the Ayn Rand Center UK. Today we'll be discussing regulation versus entrepreneurship, a topic that many of us in the free market community feel strongly about. I think maybe we see the results of the we approve of and the policies we disapprove of, and sometimes question why not more people see things the way we do. We will discuss that in a panel discussion later on in this event, but we will begin with a keynote address by Barbara Kolm. Barbara is the director of the Austrian Economic Center, the president of the Hayek Institute, the vice president of the Austrian Central Bank, and she will be speaking on limitation of individual rights and entrepreneurial freedom, democracy and civil rights in danger.
The horror of a virus has taken a lot out of each one of us and all of us as a society. It has brought out the best in us, but also our weaknesses. While many were still frozen in the initial shocks, others took matters into their own hands. Neighbors were taken care of. Telephone chains were started, masks were sewn by hand, vegetables were fetched from the farmer, countless voluntary services were offered, gaps in the market were filled by innovative entrepreneurs, a wave of solidarity and responsibility surged through the country, bringing positively despite the threatening situation and strengthening the will to get through everything together and leave no one behind. It would have been the moment to suspend all non-health related regulations. It would have been possible to allow societies to organize itself spontaneously. Let offers emerge where there is demand without bureaucratic detours, permits, certificates of competence, registrations, etc. A certain amount of chaos would have been unavoidable, but important resources would have been free to step up in where self-organization would not have come about quickly enough or to an extent that would have been sufficient. If no other positive effect could have been drawn from such an approach, then at least psychologically, the most important effect, namely the avoidance of the feeling of powerlessness, the feeling of being helplessly exposed to danger, which large parts of the population feel today, would not have come about. Certainly, there would have been winners who would have made an unrivaled offer to the general emergency situations. Presumably, there would also have been losers. Those who would not have been able to afford an unrivaled offer would not have had access to it, or those whose offer would not have been so well received. We probably dislike the aspect of spontaneous self-organization the most. Someone benefits more than others. Nevertheless, for centuries, this very aspect has been the motto of improving our living conditions, and this is the reason why research, development, and production work. Profit is a measurable motivation to which many other motivations for a company must be added. Man per se is an entrepreneur. He's constantly striving to improve something, to remedy a deficiency, to make something more comfortable or beautiful, to discover, understand, or communicate something. Whether for each other or for oneself, it's ultimately irrelevant, because the results culminate in common progress. The forced inactivity of the homo entrepreneuricus not only leads to a personal frustration and economic hardship, it also interrupts the progress of society, even of humanity, in a way that cannot be measured. Our future-oriented striving, our thinking in generations, that what distinguishes us from other living beings is at odds with the enforced inactivity. Nevertheless, I do not want to blame the governments of this world. Their reactions were as swift as they were guided by the best of intentions. In March 2020, it was probably impossible to foresee the extent of the consequences of the draconian measures, let alone how many extensions of the path once taken would come. The approach is rather directed at all of us, each and every one of us, who have forgotten that since our beginnings, it has not been the state, not a government, that has solved problems, but always our own entrepreneurship. No parliament in the world can develop a vaccine, teach mathematics, perform an operation, or do the shopping for grandma. Our legislators can only set the framework for all these services and channel the money that the taxpayers provide for them. We have forgotten that entrepreneurship provides solutions to our everyday problems, that the motivation, even if it's personal enrichment, is irrelevant. It is not even reprehensible. Entrepreneurial freedom is casually related to our individual freedom and well-being. By the time the next epidemic event occurs, and may it never be again, we hopefully will have learned the lesson, and our governments will then be free to concentrate on the real tasks. They could then trust that we would take recommendations seriously, would reorganize our businesses according to the situation, and would have vested interest in managing the threat. We would then know that politics is not omniscient and ultimately responsible, but only to the extent that we relinquish our own responsibility and restrict the homo entrepreneuricus.
Okay, so now to our panel, and we will discuss the issue of regulation versus entrepreneurship further. And our first speaker, each of our panelists will give a brief introduction, and then we will go to questions. So our first speaker is Eamonn Butler. Dr. Eamonn Butler is the co-founder and director of the Adam Smith Institute. He is the author of numerous books, including on several free market, well-known free market figures, economists. He wrote books on Hayek, Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, and as well as a primer on Ayn Rand. So, Dr. Butler.
Well, thank you very much, Razi. I just wanted to say that entrepreneurs face lots of challenges in their daily lives. Changes in demand, changes in supply conditions, labor conditions, changes in taxes, and regulation just adds another one, because regulation changes all the time too. And there are regulations everywhere you look in business. There are regulations on practitioners who can actually enter a particular market, licensing. There's regulations on codes of practice and things like that. There's also regulation on products, weight, consistency, packing, labeling, all of these kind of things. And there's even regulation on processes, how you actually make these products, whether they contain certain things or whether they're manufactured in certain ways. And of course, there are regulations on employment, regulations on the hours that your workers can work, and their wages that you must pay them, and the holidays that you must give them. And of course, the trouble is that all of these costs are much higher for small firms. And entrepreneurial firms tend to be small, or at least they start small. They may grow into huge multinationals, but they start small. So what you've got there is a time tax on small businesses. Even finding out what the regulations are can be costly to a small business. I mean, EU regulation, for example, is reckoned to be about 110,000 pages long over 35 chapters. Who in their right mind can read all of that stuff, never mind obey it? So it's a very great cost on small industries and new industries and new businesses in particular. And that's why, of course, regulation is so often sought by the established industry. It's the established practitioners who benefit most. And if you look curiously at things like the Frank-Dodd regulations in 2010 of financial services firms in the United States, that actually drove up the profits or the profit margins of the largest companies. Well, no surprise that the largest companies want to have more regulation. But the trouble is that regulation tends to be based on existing technology. It doesn't allow new technologies to come through. It's very interesting what Barbara was saying, because we had the same issues here in London, where cafes and restaurants could not put tables on the streets. And we had to campaign for, well, if you can't have a restaurant, if you can't have people inside your restaurant, can we at least occupy a bit of the pavement, bit of the sidewalk? And eventually we won that. And now, we have a cafe society in London, which we're a bit like Paris, which we've never had before. Can pubs and restaurants do takeaways, or do they have to be sit in? These sorts of things, and we've made some changes there, and I hope that those changes to regulation stick. But regulation threatens the productivity of enterprises, and so much regulation causes unproductive entrepreneurship. Lawyers, accountants, you hire people to try to get round the regulation, and that's just no way to run a business at all. So as government expands, regulation expands. I think we need to have smaller government and much less regulation.
Thank you, Eamonn. Our next speaker is Don Watkins. Don is the author of several books, including Free Market Revolution, Equal is Unfair, In Pursuit of Wealth, The Moral Case for Finance. He has worked with the Ayn Rand Institute and the Center for Industrial Progress. Don.
So one of the questions I think a lot about is, why do we even have a regulatory state? And you might think that that's obvious, but I don't think it's at all obvious. And let me start by this. One of the books I've read in the last few years that it's a really excellent book, but it made me more angry than probably any other, was a book called Bad Blood, about the company Theranos. It was a medical company that was basically a complete fraud. And part of what it highlights is something that we hear about ad nauseum, which is something that is very true and very important, which is that business and business people can do real damage. They can swindle us, they can cut corners, or worse. Like every profession, business has bad people in it. And so we need laws to protect us from bad people and bad business practices. And I'm an emphatic supporter of criminal and civil laws that protect us from force and fraud, including negligence by business. But what I'm adamantly opposed to is treating business people as criminals. And that is, in effect, what the regulatory state does. And so we should ask a question, which is, what is that distinguishes laws from regulations? And so the way I think about it is that laws properly protect freedom by prohibiting actions that violate someone's rights, and that regulations, and indeed a better name for it is controls, violate freedom. It's the government initiating force to control and prescribe voluntary decisions by individuals. So a law says you can't defraud people. You can't say, hey, here's Adderall, but it's actually arsenic. Whereas a control, what it does is say, you can't sell Adderall, or you can only sell it if we give you permission to sell it, or you have to sell it for this price, and it has to be produced in this way and distributed to these people. And so I think there's no place in a civilized society for that kind of control over individual choice, because what it really amounts to is giving the government arbitrary power over us at the expense of our rights and our freedom. So then back to the question, well, why do we have a regulatory state? It can't simply be that it's possible for businessmen to violate our rights, because we object to that kind of preventative law in many areas outside of business. So, I mean, imagine it's a fact that parents can abuse children, but we would not tolerate anything like a regulatory state for parents, where you have child protective services checking in once a month and poking around your home and saying, no, you can't raise your kids this way and you can't penalize them that way. That's the wrong religion. It's that parents are treated innocent until proven guilty. And as long as they're not violating the rights of their children, they get to decide how to raise them. And so the question is, well, why don't we extend that same view to business? And I think the answer is it has to do with our conception of the profit motive. Entrepreneurs are after profits, and the way we understand the profit motive is that it's the same kind of motive that moves criminals. It's that these are people out for themselves, and it's essentially a roll of the dice, whether they'll try to get rich by making products that we really enjoy or by taking advantage of us. And if that's true, then we need to give arbitrary power to the government, because after all, the government's not motivated by self-interest. They're just public servants who want the best for us, so we can trust them, whereas we can't trust a Richard Branson or a Jeff Bezos. And the thing that I want to stress, and maybe we'll elaborate on more as we go along, is that what actually motivates entrepreneurs and what motivates a criminal are radically different things, even if that criminal happens to present him or herself as a business person. And that consequently, the kinds of actions that each takes are going to be of a radically different nature. That it's true that entrepreneurs are after their self-interest, but they're after it in the same way that we are after our self-interest when we try to build a successful career for ourselves or a successful marriage. That is, we're trying to build a life for ourselves that's enjoyable and meaningful. And the meaning for an entrepreneur is fundamentally to be found not in wealth. It's about the creative process. That doesn't mean they don't care about profit, because if you're not creating profits, you're not creating anything. You're actually destroying value. But it's that process of creativity that actually motivates and drives them. And you can see this in somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, who could have sold Facebook for billions and indeed was told that he should sell Facebook at one point. But his motivation was not to just make a few bucks and then live on the beach. It was he wanted to create on the most ambitious scale that he could. Whereas criminals, they want the products of a creative process without the effort that process demands. They want unearned money, unearned respect, unearned self-respect. And so the point is that there's nothing about what an entrepreneur is doing that should lead us to be suspicious of them, because what you're interested in is a creative process. That is one that has a harmonious nature with respect to the interests of the people around you, not one that is at odds. And indeed, what I think entrepreneurs do is deeply moral, because they're using their mind to improve human life. And though that's true of every legitimate job and every legitimate career, when entrepreneurs are they're doing it on a grander scale, and they're seeking out innovative ways to solve old problems and new problems, or they're looking for superior ways to solve those problems. And that's something that we need to admire and liberate, not treat as immoral and criminal.
Thank you, Don. Our next speaker, our next speaker is Douglas Carswell. He is the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. He is also the co-founder of Vote Leave, which campaigned for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, and a former member of the Parliament in the UK, and I would say probably the most pro-free market member of Parliament the UK has seen in many, many years. That's not a part of the official biography. That's the unauthorized Razi Ginzberg version. But I stand by it. Douglas.
Thank you, Razi, for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm talking to you here from Mississippi, and I'm able to take part in the Free Market Roadshow happening in London and across Europe, using technology that didn't really exist on this scale even a few years ago. And to me, that says that, technology and innovation change in a way that few of us can ever be able to predict, or few of us can know for certain how it's going to unfold. The problem with regulation is that regulation is drawn up by people who presume to know what the future looks like. They presume to know what the present looks like. Hayek very famously argued that it's impossible to assemble enough information in one place to allow experts to make judgments, and that you need spontaneous order, you need organic design. You must avoid this idea of a small group of people being able to know enough, or pretend they know enough, to understand how to regulate and control things. And I can't help thinking that over the past 18 months, 24 months, during the course of this terrible virus, we've seen that conceit of a small elite who believe that they can model and work out the likely trajectory of a virus. We see this conceit embedded at the very heart of government. It's right at the heart of the DNA of the administrative state in most Western countries now. This idea that you can know enough, you can put enough data and information on a spreadsheet to produce a model that can tell you what the future looks like. And I think clearly you can't do that. There are far too many variables. There are so many variables you can't possibly know what the future looks like. And this is the fundamental problem with regulation. So why do we have so much regulation? I think fundamentally that the driver behind regulation is essentially parasitic. We see a symbiotic relationship between parasitic vested interests and the administrative state to impose regulations, not in the interests of the consumer, not in the interests of the wider public, but in the interests of vested interests and the administrative state. And here in the state of Mississippi, we see this all around us. We're notionally in a free market state, in a free market republic, in a free market country. But here in Mississippi, you need something called a certificate of need in order to expand healthcare provision. Now, here in Mississippi, more people in the state of Mississippi were unable to get healthcare last year because they couldn't afford it than in any other state in America. And yet, if you want to expand the provision of healthcare in Mississippi, you need a permit. And it's not just any old permit. The permit that you need is issued by a board on which your competitors or would-be competitors will sit. It is a straightforward protectionist racket. You see all sorts of protectionism for things like occupational licensing in order to, for example, become a hair braider. Now, you could probably judge by the nature of my haircut that I probably don't need the services of a barber or a hair braider that often. But if I were to need the services of a barber or a hair braider in the state of Mississippi, I would need to go to somebody who has been licensed by a group of officials in Mississippi. Now, this can't possibly be in the interests of the consumer. It is a small group of what economists call producer capture. Now, producer capture is alive and well, and it is robbing Western countries of their vitality. I just finished with an observation that over the past few hundred years, what does the Republic of Venice, what does the Dutch Republic, what does England in the 18th and 19th century, and what did California in the 20th century all have in common? At one time, they were very laissez-faire free market societies that didn't have vested interests and regulation, and they flourished as a result. And each of them in turn gradually found vested interests emerging, and the body politic of the Venetian Republic, the Dutch Republic, England in the early 20th century, and California tragically today, the body politic was captured by vested interests. And each of those four societies, having once been at the vanguard of innovation and technology and human progress, slowly became museum pieces. I think the lesson is clear. If you want to thrive and you want to flourish, you need to keep in check the parasitic vested interests that will work with the administrative state in its various guises in their interests. You need to keep the parasitic interests in check, and you need to recognize that history is a constant struggle between the parasitic and the productive. And if the parasitic prevail, you get dark periods of human history. If the productive prevail, well, goodness knows what we'll be doing in a few years' time. It's thanks to the productive we can talk to each other thousands of miles apart. If the productive are allowed free rein, human living standards and human moral progress will know no bounds.
Thank you, Douglas. And we will now go to a discussion with our panelists. If you have any questions, if you're watching this live, please submit them on the YouTube live chat or on Facebook. And by the way, Douglas, when you mentioned the need for a license for hairdressers, I recently cut my own hair at home, and I wonder if in Mississippi I would get arrested for that. I don't know if you're allowed to do
Shocking.
that. I didn't get a license before I did that.
You can buy a firearm in Mississippi, but you can't cut someone's hair without a license, and you certainly can't buy a bottle of wine on a Sunday, because goodness knows what would happen.
Well, I actually did have a question later regarding the differences or similarities you see between the two countries, and we'll get to that. And Don, you mentioned that businesses can cause damage, and we should have laws making sure that they don't do that, or that they're punished if they do. But I wonder what the cultural atmosphere that allows or encourages that. And I think, and this is from memory, so correct me if I'm wrong, that in your book In Pursuit of Wealth, which was co-authored with Eamonn Brooke, was there a mention that something like 55% of murderers in movies are business people? Is that accurate?
I forget the exact percentage, but yeah, I mean, in general, it's business people who are overwhelmingly committing crimes on TV. And that's only one eloquent illustration of the fact that we're kind of saturated with this message that people who are engaged in business, who are seeking profits, who are starting companies, there's something that we should be suspicious of. And if you actually talk to these people, and if you read interviews, so I've written about Bernie Madoff, who talked a lot about his kind of motives and what it was that he was after that led him down the course where he swindled people out of hundreds of billions of dollars. And it was nothing like Mark Zuckerberg saying, yeah, I could retire forever with lots of billions of dollars, but I want to create something amazing, and so I'm going to keep going with Facebook. It was, man, I'm going to show these Wall Street guys that I'm smart. I'm going to show them how intelligent, what a big shot I am. They're really coming from a place of lack of self-esteem, lack of self-confidence, and they're looking for kind of signals about their importance and their creativity. And so if you have that kind of perspective, that these are two radically different motivations, then you're not going to have a knee-jerk reaction of whenever you hear that somebody has a lot of money or that they run a business of there must be a kind of hidden crime or a crime to come. And so I think the more that you can get that there's a completely different way of coming at life that we're seeing from entrepreneurs, then I think it becomes much less plausible that we need a whole, in the US, 35 feet of shelf space to catalog all the way that the federal government's going to regulate every little aspect of what they do. We wouldn't tolerate that if we viewed an industry or a career role as something noble and important and additive to human life. And I think that's what really needs to be challenged.
Douglas.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what the question was. Forgive me.
The question is regarding the cultural atmosphere that encourages maybe the view that business people are sort of guilty until proven innocent, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If you go to somewhere like Glasgow, at a time when Glasgow was the centre of innovation and industrial output and productivity, they venerated some of the city fathers. If you look at various societies like the Dutch and the Venetians, they great kudos and respect and esteem on entrepreneurs. I think culturally we're at risk, particularly in the UK, but also to some extent in the United States, of moving into a world where people disapprove of entrepreneurs and their success. I'm fascinated by how the Chinese state treats people like Jack Ma, because if it's the case that people like Jack Ma can grow fabulously wealthy and flaunt their great wealth in China, and live quite freely and happily, then I suspect China really will eclipse the West. If, on the other hand, the Chinese elite find it intolerable that a single individual can be of such great utility to millions of Chinese that they become fabulously wealthy, and they start to bully them and expropriate their wealth, which looks increasingly likely, then I suspect China may be about to repeat the mistakes of the Ming. The Ming famously treated entrepreneurs as the lowest of the low and forced their merchants to wear distinctive clothing. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that societies, pre-modern societies, whether it's India or medieval Japan or China or indeed medieval England, had one thing in common. They all treated merchants with absolute contempt. I mean, it's no coincidence that Shakespeare wrote a play called The Merchant of Venice, Venice being one of the few states in the Middle Ages that treated its merchant class with respect, and hence it flourished. I do think that there's a natural human tendency to be skeptical and suspicious and contemptuous. Well, a natural inclination on the part of the elites to treat the merchant class with contempt and to whip up hostility towards the productive. We managed to avoid this for a couple of hundred years in the West, and hence we've grown rich. The merchants richer than the rest of us, but all of us have prospered as a result. I fear that if we return to the idea that we treat entrepreneurs the way we used to treat entrepreneurs in medieval England or in medieval China, I suspect we will probably be as wealthy as we were back then, i.e. not very wealthy at all. It's wonderful that Jack Ma and these Jeff Bezos are able to become fabulously wealthy. And I think in a healthy society, they should be revered for what they've achieved. Every time I go on Amazon, I'm showing my age here, but every time I go on Amazon, I find it rather miraculous that I'm able to get a product at the lowest possible price without having to go to the shops. I think it's wonderful that Bezos has all the wealth he has, and I wish him lots of luck. I just wish he would take one or two politicians on his trip to Mars with him next time.
Eamonn.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting what the cultural background of this is. I very much like Don's analogy of raising children, that you wouldn't raise children as you do the regulatory state, that you assume that parents actually love their children and they want to raise them in a good way. You know that bad things will happen and parents will abuse children and smack them and harm them and do other things. But at the same time, you give them the benefit of the doubt. And you have broad laws to say, yes, actually hitting and hurting children, treating them, psychological damage to them, whatever you like, that is wrong. But how you raise it is how you raise children is very much your affair. And if you want to educate them in one way as opposed to another, you should be able to do that. Of course, what is happening now is that usually state educators are saying, no, children shouldn't be educated at home. They have to be educated by proper licensed professional educators, which means, of course, us, and it's this vested interest. So what I'd actually like to ask of Douglas, being a former politician, is why politicians actually fall for this stuff. Why is it that the vested interests, usually in the established companies, the established trade unions and all the rest of it, why do they have so much power in promoting new regulations that basically keep out the competition? Can't politicians see that and argue with them that no, this would reduce competition? What is it? What stranglehold they got. I don't believe that they've got enough dirt on politicians that they can tell them what laws to pass. There's something strange about the political psyche in this.
Very much so. You're absolutely spot on. Having been a member of parliament for 12 years, I came to the conclusion that most people in politics are basically an ego in search of a purpose. Now, I'm not saying that to be rude about my former colleagues, but I genuinely believe that most people who enter the House of Commons or stand for office, for Congress, or that they want to be important. They want to be big. They want the acclaim. They want the place on the stage. And some of them, to be fair, might have a burning ambition to try and achieve something. I know a handful of colleagues, there were 6 when I first entered the House of Commons, who shared my view that we should leave the European Union, the reason I stood for public office in Britain. You may get some who say that they want to, I don't know, abolish income tax or increase income tax. Then you'll get some who will, they'll say they want to improve the healthcare system, although they won't actually have a clear idea as to how that should be done, or they'll say they care passionately about the defense of the realm without ever making it quite clear what that actually means. But basically what they are is they're looking like an actor wanting to be in the limelight. They're searching around for a script and for a scriptwriter. Now, if you give them the free market script, the Friedman script, the Hayek script, you can occasionally get rare moments of brilliance where the purpose that the politicians have is in a free market direction. But more often, it's the people with the spreadsheets, the people who delusionally tell them that they can accurately predict the trajectory of a virus, or can accurately forecast what the appropriate interest rate should be. Those are the people who tend to get their ear. And if you become a minister in Britain, irrespective of what party you are, you have the same sort of officials with the same empirical, bogus empiricism, you might call it, surrounding them. I often feel that actually we've been governed by the same people for the past 20 years. And actually the parties may change and the personalities in the cabinet may change. But the reason why it feels as if we're governed by the same people is because the advice they receive and the same bogus empiricism is still there. And I'm afraid if you have a group of essentially managerialist people in public office who want to do, as David Cameron vacuously said, only what works, you end up with people who will be told what works by a machine that has a vested interest in doing things by top-down design. If I was to teach children in a school that the natural world was a product of creation, people would rightly say, hang on a second, you've got to actually teach evolution. Creationism doesn't explain the way the natural world works. Why do we put up with creationism or top-down designism in explaining human, social, and economic outcomes? We basically were governed by creationists who revert to a form of economic and social creationism because they are ignorant, essentially, of the evolutionary top-down organic nature of society. There's a wonderful book written, 6 books actually, a couple of thousand years ago by a Roman poet called Lucretius. And I'm ashamed to say I only discovered him quite recently. But he rather beautifully explains that the world, not just the natural world, but all the world around us is a consequence of organic design. And I rather wish that perhaps all politicians had a chance to study a bit more Lucretius at school and a little bit less bogus empiricism from their COD MBA courses.
So we do have a bunch of questions. I'm going to start by combining 2 questions. And Mary Aline asks, is some minimal amount of regulation needed? And Kai asks, a lot of people say they don't want much or little regulation, but rather smart regulation. Is there such a thing as smart regulation as an alternative? Eamonn, let's start with you.
No, I don't think there is, and I think that's partly for reasons that Douglas was saying, and to which I would add, that regulation is promoted by existing interests that are concentrated interests. Large companies, for example, have a concentrated interest in getting grants and subsidies for their industry. They have a concentrated interest in organizing their industry and keeping people out of their industry so that they can make more money at other people's expense. It's a very concentrated interest, as opposed to all the huge diversity of new companies that are coming on stream, most of them small. They haven't got the time or the energy to lobby members of parliament and members of Congress. So their interests, if you like, are not represented at all. So you've got a certain imbalance there. And so I don't think regulation is ever going to be smart. And certainly when regulation gets to politicians, it's definitely not going to be smart, because officials in particular, it's not going to be smart, because officials are very risk averse. Because in officialdom, if you mess up, well, you don't get fired, but you get put sideways, or your career's on hold for a year or something like that. But there's no great benefit in the bureaucracy for taking a risk that it might pay off dramatically. So it's a completely different mindset. And so I don't think that any part of government is going to be entrepreneurial. I don't think any part of government is going to be all that smart. On the contrary, it's almost baked in that they won't be smart, that they'll be very cautious, they won't take risks, they won't take chances, they won't leave people to get on with their own lives rather than try to regulate them. On the question of whether you need minimum regulation, well, I think actually, Don had it right. You need minimum law. That you can't produce stuff that's going to poison people, for example. That's a simple law. You don't need pages and pages and pages of detailed regulation to achieve that. You just say, no, I'm sorry, producing a product that kills people is just not allowed.
Douglas.
During the early stages of the COVID pandemic in the United Kingdom, it was pretty clear that there was sort of what the government was trying to do was sensible, which is to encourage people to minimize certain behaviors that would maximize the likelihood of the virus spreading. They could have done this by explaining to the adult population what they were trying to achieve, by explaining the risks, and by allowing the adults to determine for themselves how best to meet those outcomes. Instead, what the government ended up doing was producing an extraordinarily complex series of micromanagerial directives, which their own people in number 10 at Downing Street were unable to comply with when driving to places like Barnard Castle, famously. Now, it strikes me that if your own staff are unable to comply with the complexities and the micromanagerialist directives that you're trying to issue, it ought to be perfectly obvious that you're doing something wrong. This is not the way to achieve the outcomes you want. So I think smart regulation should be minimal. It should specify what the intended outcome is, and it shouldn't be too prescriptive. One of the problems with the British administrative state, and it's the same in the United States, is that the administrative state has contracted out the process of regulation to a series of autonomous bodies, which then issue guidelines that have statutory weight and are used by the courts as though they're the law. And the guidelines are unending. They become a sort of a blizzard of rules as to what can and can't be done. So I think what one needs to do is to return to the idea that you have regulation, but regulation should be anchored in primary legislation. It should be something that has been determined and voted on by your representatives. It's certainly not something that should be authored by unelected officials at arm's length from government. And it should basically rest on the assumption that a court might at some stage interpret whether or not a course of action someone's taken complies with the intended rules. It should be law-based. It shouldn't be what regulation has become, which is so detailed as to in effect be arbitrary and in effect to be impossible to comply with. That is not smart regulation. Often when politicians think in terms of smart regulation, they're talking about ever more complex rulemaking. there's nothing smart about that. Therein lies ever more complexity and arbitrary rule.
Yeah, I mean, if you put the question in explicit terms, it's, do you need the government to have arbitrary power over the lives of innocent people? And of course, you don't need that. And indeed, when you give them that, you suffer. And there's no intelligent way in order to implement the idea that you have arbitrary power to decide how other people live. Now, again, the kind of counter to that, I think, is, well, look, you're talking about arbitrary power for the government, but isn't that just bouncing the arbitrary power of business? And that's where I think it's really crucial to keep in mind a vital distinction between the kind of power that business has and the kind of power that government has. That business has it has real power, but it's the power to offer things on a market that people are free to accept or reject. So it's the power of the dollar, or the power of the pound, or the power of some kind of currency. It's the power of trade. And if I don't like Amazon, if I think that their products are bad, or I don't like their business model, I don't shop at Amazon. Whereas the government has the power of the gun. It has the power to compel me. So, Amazon can offer me a job and I might think, no, that job is not a good job, so I don't take it. The government doesn't offer me things that I can take or leave. It says, this is what they make us an offer you can't refuse. And so you don't need somebody with the power of the gun in order to bounce the power of the dollar. They're two radically different things. One leaves us free to go our own way, and one doesn't. And it's only when business and business people start using the power of the gun, which they can do in the form of a Bernie Madoff type who is actually engaging in criminality, or as the other panelists have talked about, they can do it by, in effect, using the government's gun to get their own special favors, their own special protections. That's what we need to be protected from. And the way that you protect that is through rule of law and a government that protects rights. And that is a real government. That is not saying you can do whatever you want. It's saying, no, you are free to live your lives as long as you don't stop other people from doing what they want.
Yeah, and along the lines of that, Robert says in the YouTube chat, when people make a valid case for regulation, it turns out that some things that are called regulation are properly considered precedent or established law. Simon asks, also in the YouTube chat, what's more cumbersome for entrepreneurs, higher taxes or regulations, both in principle and in the current climate in the West?
Well, I think the answer to that is clear, and it's actually tax. Tax greatly raises the risk that you face when you start a new business or start an entrepreneurial business. Already, if you start a new business, you're taking a risk, right? You've probably got to leave your job, your salaried job, and you put your life savings in a business. You maybe have to mortgage your home. You have to be prepared to live with a very reduced income for a lot of time. Maybe family holidays and treats are off for several years. So you're taking a big risk in the hope that this will pay off and that you will be able to produce a business that will sell products that people absolutely love, and then they'll give you money. And you'll make a lot of money. Whereas if you have very high taxes on your profits, then that increases the risk even further. You've got to make even more just to break even. So most studies show that that is a big downer. But at the same time, as I say, I think that regulation is perhaps not measured by the economists in this, because it's very hard. You can measure tax very easily. You can see how much in dollars and cents it is, but it's hard to know the actual cost of regulation. And I think that, as I say, many smaller companies, regulation is effectively a tax on their time, just finding out what the regulations are and then setting up all of the organizational things you need to deal with them. And that is a huge downer on competition and new enterprises and new entrants. So the answer is actually both, but we can measure one, but it's more difficult to measure the other.
Done.
I mean, it really depends on the context, but I'd say overall, regulations are way more damaging, because if you had a situation where you had complete freedom to function and create, but you knew some portion of your income, and let's say it's a high proportion, is going to be taken, you know the rules of the game, and you can construct a business that will allow you to function under that. But what regulation does is it opens up arbitrary uses of government power. So if you looked at what happened during the heart of the pandemic and the early days of the pandemic, when different scientists and doctors were trying to figure out, all right, we need to create tests and we need to put them on the market. In the United States, they had no clue what they were allowed to do. They had no clue, if we create this and if we invest time in it, can we put it in the market? And then they'd find out, no, you can't. You have to rely on these government tests that end up failing. But it's that kind of unpredictability that stops the ability of an entrepreneur to function. Whereas taxes can make it really burdensome in the sense of I don't get the rewards that I deserve. It's the unpredictability, and particularly for bigger businesses and entrepreneurs leading those, antitrust, where basically you're always in violation of it the second that you enter business, that anything can be held to be anti-competitive, whether you raise prices, lower prices, or keep them the same as your competition. That is the it paralyzes businessmen in a way that makes it impossible to engage in the kind of long-term planning and experimentation they need to engage in. So in the end, I think taxes are a problem, but entrepreneurs can deal with big burdens if they know and can predict what government's going to do. And the regulatory state takes that power of prediction away.
Good point.
Douglas.
I mean, I think it entirely depends on the rate of taxation and the intrusiveness of the regulation. I would just go on to say, I think there are different types of regulation. Britain, having left the European Union, one of the things we're looking at the moment is which bits of regulation do we need to get rid of. I mean, clearly the EU Clinical Trials Directive has to go. That I think we've seen on a grand scale how redundant that is. I would say that a lot of the EU regulation on data protection needs to go. They're inhibiting the development of an intelligent data-driven economy in the UK. But there are other regulations which probably would just pay to leave. And the reason why it would probably pay to leave is because once business has got used to them, if it's not actually excluding new entrants into a market, they gradually become redundant. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that there are regulations regarding taxis in London that require you to carry a bale of hay, going back to the days when taxis were horse-driven. So, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that you get a natural tendency for some regulations to become essentially redundant because of technological change and changes in material and innovation. So I think there are some regulations that you can just kind of leave and people will get used to them and they'll fall away. But there are clearly those, such as those governing financial services, data, and the pharmaceutical sector, where one needs to very aggressively remove the regulatory regime that's been in place for 20 or 30 years.
Right. I'm wondering if that's why Uber lost their license for a while. Maybe they weren't carrying the bale of hay. Marilyn asked a question that sort of follows up from this. Where should deregulation start? What part of the economy? Done.
Ooh.
Oh, well, I mean, I think above all, at least in the US scenario, antitrust is a huge one. I think it's the most paralyzing of the most important companies. I think this is more the threats to come, but I'm very worried about energy regulations because I think that's a fundamental. There's energy and finance are the two fundamental industries. So if I think about regulations impacting particular industries, I'm most worried about finance and energy, though finance is a more complicated one because if you just start peeling away individual financial regulations, sometimes you can make things worse rather than better, as we've certainly seen in the United States. You need a much more rich conception than just start gutting things, particularly so long as there's a central bank. But I would name those at least at the forefront of my mind as some of the most important to do away with.
Douglas.
I think Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. There have been many different assaults on regulation in many different countries, and we've set up deregulation panels and had deregulation ministers and all the rest of it. And so often they get rid of, as Douglas says, a few redundant regulations that might be 200 years old and nobody even knows they exist. But they don't tend to get rid of really serious ones. And one of the troubles is that every regulation is there for a reason. It may not be a good reason. It may not be to protect people's lives and health and all the rest of it. It may be because some industry in the past has promoted a regulation and the politicians have given in to their lobbying, and because they create a lot of noise and they say that the public will be damaged unless we regulate business in a certain way. So these regulations come into existence for a reason, and it's very difficult then to get rid of them, because when you say, well, let's scrap the regulations on, I mean, we used to have the British government used to publish a leaflet on how to climb a ladder. And okay, now you can see why it's not bad to know how to put up a ladder and to climb it safely. But at the same time, if you have regulations on that kind of thing, you'll never get rid of them. Because people will say, well, if you get rid of that regulation, people will fall off ladders and break their necks. So you're not trusting people, as Don says. You're treating them as criminals from the start. But every regulation has a reason for being there. So when you try and get rid of them, you find it's extremely difficult. The place that I would start, I think, is with small business. I would say that businesses under 5, 10 people, a dozen people, something like that, which I think is a sort of a cutoff point where businesses change. That I would say, look, these are risky ventures. When you join a business like that, you don't get job security. We can't guarantee you that job. We can't say the employer can never fire you because there's regulations about it. Big companies, okay, yeah, you can do that, but smaller companies, I think you just say they're new, they're enterprising, they're experiments. Let them get on and do things their way, and as long as it's safe, then we don't really mind how they do it, and they might come up with something absolutely sensational.
Here in Mississippi, building on what Eamonn said, here in Mississippi, we've been pushing for something called a sandbox bill. And this is basically a bill that would allow permissionless innovation in the state of Mississippi. Quite often, innovation happens so fast that the regulators haven't quite worked out how to deal with it. And in such a scenario, you end up with entrepreneurs, as I've met here in Mississippi, who are basically asking state officials if they can have permission to do something that the officials don't even know exists yet. So what our sandbox bill is trying to do is to allow people to do things without requiring permission before they bring something to market. There's a lot of trial and error in enterprise. And rather than constantly needing to get permission to do something, the idea of our sandbox bill is that entrepreneurs would be able to go ahead, do what they want to do, and almost kind of retrospectively get permission once they've worked out how it's best done. And I think if other states have done this, Utah has kind of led the way, Mississippi is coming in a close second. If we can do this, one of the geniuses of the American system, hopefully all those entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley will move to Jackson, Mississippi. Wouldn't it be wonderful?
So as we wrap up, I was thinking of a conversation I had with somebody I know who told me about how they spilled some wine on a wall in a building owned by a major billion-dollar corporation, and they said, "Yeah, I don't care. They have money. It's not that big of a problem." And this is someone that, from what I know about them, it's somebody young who is ambitious about getting promoted in his own job and so on. And I think, at some point, and we still have a culture that does appreciate things like that does appreciate somebody, at least at the beginner level, being successful. But at some point it stops. At some point, you are too successful to be, I guess, good or moral. So, and this kind of goes back to the to where we started in the discussion. I wonder, Douglas, you were in Parliament. I wonder, what would happen. I guess if a member of Parliament suggested, uh, making it easier for entrepreneurs to start a business, that wouldn't be too controversial. But if a member of Parliament said, we need to make it easier for billion-dollar corporations to increase their profits, that would probably not be taken as well. So, any thoughts on that, or any closing thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, you see members of Parliament on both sides of the House who will pay lip service to supporting our entrepreneurs and supporting our businesses. I mean, if they had any philosophical consistency or credibility, they would know it's not our entrepreneurs. The very definition is that these are private individuals pursuing their interests, and that we should support them in doing that. And the size of the business should be immaterial. The fashion is to have a go at Google and Amazon and to have a go at the big corporations, but to sort of want to associate oneself closely with small businesses as a constituency MP in your constituency. And morally, they're the same thing. They're people producing a product to somebody in a voluntary transactional relationship that the person wants to provide. It's a profoundly moral thing when somebody sells something to someone at a price that they want to pay. If we were to have a slightly more libertarian philosophy in our body politic, people would recognize that what Amazon does for us every day and what your local sandwich shop does for you every day, they're both wonderful. One is feeding you at a fraction of the time and effort it would take for you to produce that sandwich yourself. The other is giving you access to global markets at the click of a button. They're both profoundly moral and good things. I think the fact that the political establishment can't see that says that free marketeers like us have a huge job of education to do. We need to make sure that people standing for public office recognize the free market is a profoundly good moral force. It feeds us. It's the great driver of human progress. It's our failure that politicians are able to get away with dissing entrepreneurs just because they're big and successful.
I think it's a very important point, Razi, this idea that, well, big companies are different, they can afford it and all the rest of it. A lot of innovation, a lot of entrepreneurship actually occurs within big companies, partly because they can afford to spend money on research and development, and they can make mistakes and all the rest of it, which smaller individuals may not be able to do so much. And you look at, as Douglas says, the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples. These are incredibly innovative entrepreneurial companies. So you have to realize that there's entrepreneurship in large businesses as well as small. And if you want to encourage entrepreneurship, we're all agreed that entrepreneurship's a good thing and we should have more of it. Well, in that case, you do actually have to get out of the way of larger businesses as well, as long as they're not abusing their market position, as long as there is an element of competition, then let them get on with it. But you're right. The rules should apply to everybody, large and small.
Done.
I think a lot of the attacks on business and the kind of attitude that you described, Razi, is envy masquerading as morality. That is, if you have any concern for morality and justice, what is a greater achievement than something like creating the modern world? I mean, Amazon, without them, what would our life have been like during the pandemic, all being locked in? without Netflix, without social media, whatever the problems these have, these are great achievements. And so much of the attacks on business pose as, oh, well, they don't pay workers enough. Well, so what are you paying workers? Nothing, because you never started anything, you never created anything. And so your self-esteem is bound up in the fact that you're better than people who achieved more than you have, and they're evil because they've achieved so much. I think that is so monstrous that if one's moral judgment of yourself should be bound up in how creative and how many values you've actually achieved and brought into the world, and the kind of looking down your nose at somebody because they've been so incredibly successful. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. Indeed, I think you can only understand Marxism as let's create a whole ideology around envy. And yet that's one of the ugliest parts of the human soul. And so the people who've succeeded in doing something good should be celebrated and congratulated for it. And we should be really thankful, because the world that we live in is in many respects a miracle. I mean, the pandemic is just such an illustration of this. The fact that using computers and using the internet, scientists were able to come up in a matter of days with something that is magnificently effective at curing a disease that's killed millions of people. The fact that we're having this conversation and that we're oceans apart from each other, these are amazing achievements that we shouldn't take for granted. And I think being thankful for them and to the people who've created them is a good start at a moral attitude.
Yeah, Douglas.
Razi, if I could just jump in there. One further thought. I wonder if one of the reasons why the prevailing climate amongst public intellectuals in Britain and America is so hostile to entrepreneurs is, and it feeds into the point that Don beautifully made about envy. I suspect that a lot of academics and intellectuals, they've been to university, they've spent too long at university, they've got PhDs coming out of their ears, they've probably got far better grades than many of their classmates. And they reach midlife and are rather disappointed that the guy that they were at school with who didn't study as hard as they did is making more than they are. And I wonder if a lot of our public debate that disses and puts down entrepreneurs and successful business is basically a question of third-raters who are clever but in an academic way, are basically envious of people who are smart in an entrepreneurial, non-reflective, intellectual way, who can actually make things and entrepreneurs and businesses happen. I think envy is this is just developing the point that Don made. I think envy does lie at the heart of it. I've been very, very struck by a lot of people my own age who chose a path in academia, who seem sort of vociferously hostile to the less academic colleagues and less academic peer group, who've actually gone and done something with their life. And I think that probably explains a lot of it.
Well, I want to thank you all for an excellent discussion, and thanks to the Austrian Economic Center for putting it together. And I think it's right to also thank the entrepreneurs who, as you all mentioned, made it possible for us to, from different parts of the world, have this discussion, broadcast it to live to anybody in the world who can watch it. Anything from a big screen TV to a phone, and that is great. But you know what else is great is having the Free Market Roadshow live in person, like it used to be, and still streamed online to the world. And I know last year, I think it was May, we did the digital Free Market Roadshow London, and I said we will have an in-person Free Market Roadshow soon. That has yet to happen, but I will say it again. This will happen in person very soon, and I look forward to that. So thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you, Razi.